Lovely to see you, and I'm glad that it worked out. Now, I'll briefly introduce you, and I'm sure many of the participants already know you, and then we can continue with your talk. So welcome all again to our keynote speech session. It's my great and immense pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Jean Comaroff, an absolutely transformative scholar and educator. And we are very, very privileged to have her here with us. Jean Comaroff is the Alfred North Whitehead Professor of African and African American Studies and Anthropology at Harvard University and Honorary Professor at the University of Cape Town. Educated at the University of Cape Town and the London School of Economics, she was formerly the Bernard E. and Ellen C. Sonny Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. As all of us, I assume, very well know, she has widely published and earned numerous awards and honors. I had the privilege to take her classes at the University of Chicago, and she's a tremendously generous teacher, advisor, and mentor. And it's no surprise that she has won several awards for excellence in undergraduate and graduate teaching. Her extraordinary scholarly energy, brilliance, and intellectual commitment and groundbreaking work have been an inspiration to me and many, many other generations of scholars and students. Her research, primarily conducted in Southern Africa, has focused on the interplay of capitalism, modernity, and colonialism, on theorizing the contemporary world from beyond its hegemonic centers. Her writing has covered a range of more specific topics, including religion and medicine, magic and materiality, law and crime, democracy and difference. Her work, together with John Comaroff, not only proves so powerfully anthropology's and ethnography's importance in theory making, but also shows us the significance of South as a set of relations in understanding and theorizing our historical present, as well as what is yet to come. Once again, we are very privileged to have you here, Jean, with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Better late than never. Vigilantism, both as a phenomenon and as an object of study, appears to have returned with a vengeance in our late modern world. But outlaw justice has always been with us in some form. An assertion of a rectitude beyond the law, a right in both senses, it is sovereignty's constitutive outside. As Carl Schmitt would have it, it is the exception that defines the normative dual order. In vigilantism, the criminal meets the sublime. Its modern antecedents lie in the swashbuckling vendetta, the private war, the rough music used to out sexual offenders in 17th century rural England. It is heir too to the social banditry that defied enclosure and the advent of bourgeois law, iconic of a long unresolved struggle between the populace and the modern state as Leviathan. Recall that Charles Tilley once referred memorably to the early modern state as a quintessential protection racket with the advantage of legitimacy. The sense that we have been experiencing a resurrection of vigilantism was powerfully reinforced when hordes of insurrectionist Trump supporters, a rabble of Mad Max commandos and white supremacists, stormed the US Capitol, bent on retrieving a national sovereignty allegedly stolen by a criminal liberal cabal. For Patrick Gatara, a wry reporter from Kenya, the mob rule once associated with banana republics had migrated northwards to what he called first world shithole countries as Papadon's failed state. Of course, many would agree with political scientist Jonathan Obert that vigilantism has long been an American tradition. From lynching and citizens' arrest to the ever more sanctified Second Amendment right to bear arms, he insists, American democracy has always ridden on an unresolved relationship between violence and justice. But these days, there's an increasingly audible sense in many quarters of that an unresponsive oppressive rule of law calls for popular correctives. To be sure, the readiness of ordinary citizens to act in defense of order, rights, and patrimony has been ever more evident across the planet in recent years, assuming an expanding array of guises, from grassroots militias to road policing, weaponized community watches to anti-crime rituals, customary discipline to populist execution. It is manifest too in the enduring salience of honor killings, hate crimes, and lynching, in a proliferating array of extrajudicial practices on the slippery grounds between private security, state policing, and corporate self-protection, and on an expanding digital scape that hosts all manner of internet vigilantism, citizen crime apps, and cyber shaming. But if vigilantism has been reborn in communities across the world, especially, as Ray Abraham suggests, in the frontier zones of the state, why there and why now? Issues of definition, attribution, and conceptual specificity loom especially large in respect of vigilantism. While generally taken to describe the efforts of ordinary actors to protect, enforce, and punish beyond the authority of the state, brutally if needs be, it is an inherently ambivalent construct that covers a wide range of forms and forces. Vigilantism bespeaks both terror and divinity. What Walter Benjamin described as law-founding violence is at its essence. Moreover, it tends to emerge out of fields of struggle. One person's guardian is another person's thug. Calling somebody a vigilante is often itself a political act, more readily an ascription made by others than one chosen for oneself. Until quite recently, vigilantes, like pirates or mercenaries, had an anachronistic pre-modern ring, appropriate to Gothic fiction, superheroes, or the Wild West. It conjured the outlaw charisma of a Lone Ranger, of Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider. While the recent recommissioning of the term might reflect an expanding phenomenon in the world, or at least a popular perception of one, it has also served to reclassify and reify long-standing practices, like cow protection in India, for example, which has been labeled vigilantism since the early 2000s, but has a complex history dating back to the 1700s. Here and elsewhere, outlaw enforcement tends to emerge out of popular politics of the long run, being embedded in force fields of religious, cultural, class, racial, and generational struggle. Of gender and sexuality too, though this has been often overlooked or trivialized, as in the killing of bus drivers in Juarez, Mexico in 2013, in response to the repeated rape of female passengers in their vehicles, or the campaign of the Gulabi gang, the so-called pink vigilantes of Uttar Pradesh, North India, who in 2006 declared war on domestic violence against poor rural women. Part of what they insisted was a movement for social justice. In fact, the line between vigilantism, sensu stricto, and communal defense, revolt, even guerrilla warfare, is seldom clear-cut. Neither is the structuralization of popular justice, as it mediates between the state and the subaltern, the public and the private. The fact that such disparate entities as the IRA, the Klan, and the Mafia have all at one time or another been associated with vigilantism does not make them vigilante organizations, although each may be seen as having engaged in rogue protection, mob justice, or law-founding violence. All this has implications for identifying the social historical conditions, past and present, that prompt people to take the law into their own hands. The common sense association of popular justice with state weakness or corruption, particularly beyond the West, has been contested by scholars who see the phenomenon more as a matter of structure than geography. Vigilantism, argues Abrams, occurs on the margins of polities where the reach of the law runs out, or in interior enclaves and islands where populations are unreachable by or alienated from the law. Integral to the very form of the modern polity, he says, it is a product of the inability of liberal governments to satisfy their citizens' needs for order and protection. Yet despite what he terms its dangerous potential, popular justice for Abrams extends in functional symbiosis with the state. The more it changes, as the old cliche goes, the more it remains the same. How then do we account for what, on the face of it, seems to be a dramatic increase in its incidence across the late modern world, not merely on the margins of the modern state, but in their heartlands? For vigilantism today appears to be less the product of proliferating frontiers inside and out than of the growing inchoateness of the liberal polity itself and the social order on which it is founded, the social contract, of the lines within it between law and order, protectors and predators, police and privatized violence, also between appearance and reality, social order and craven conspiracy. What has shifted is the very nature of modern state sovereignty and its capacity to secure authority and underwrite truth. These shifts, I would argue, are prefigured most acutely on the imperial margins of the Euro-American world, where the liberal ideals of modern state sovereignty have always been in question. Scholars like Dipesh Chakrabarti, for instance, claim that a popular propensity to usurp the law in the name of order and justice has been especially evident in post-colonies like India, where everyday political culture bears witness to the incompleteness of colonial sovereignty. The reign of the Raj, Chakrabarti notes, was not founded on a Hobbesian consent of the people assembled. It was a sovereignty acquired by force, imposed on those whose lives and liberty were in the power of others. By contrast with European states that strive to cultivate the fiction of homogeneous nationhood, colonial regimes famously ruled by cultivating difference, exacerbating inequalities of caste, class, ethnicity, and religion. The fragile unity of anti-colonial struggles rarely held long enough to prevent the subsequent fracture of the post-colonial polity. Furthermore, these struggles primed factions of the populace to defy the law in the name of a higher order moral authority. What Nehru famously called hooliganism haunted efforts of the newly democratic India to cultivate proper civic politics and to tame the ferocious sense of a popular sovereignty. Arjuna Pajirai argues, similarly, that a culture of disrespect for the law remains an integral ingredient of Indian democracy, often invoking a transcendent order of sanctified cosmopolitics that the state itself is ever more ready to embrace. One of the most distinctive quests for popular justice in modern India has centered on the practice of so-called cow vigilantism mentioned earlier, in which Hindu militants act to protect cattle and discipline those, typically Muslims or Dalits, who are accused of sacrilege and butchery. Despite a long history of cattle killing riots and lethal violence between Hindus and Muslims, there's been a notable escalation of cow vigilantism since the ascent of the Bharatiya Janata Party in 2014. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of vigilante groups are said to have sprung to life in towns and villages across northern India. Deadly assaults on non-Hindus accused of slaughtering and transporting cattle or working with leather and meat have risen sharply, encouraged, claim Human Rights Watch of India, by a government seeking to attract Hindu votes and issuing what amounts to a free pass on mob attacks on minorities. For Pajirai, the BJP regime has cultivated a form of vigilante righteousness among the Hindu rank and file, who feel empowered to exact a kind of brutal punishment on those they take to offend the sanctified hierarchies of caste, class, and patronage. Such popular policing is metonymic. It acts on ethnically stereotyped transgressors, treasonous Muslims, unclean Dalits, to perform a pedagogy of violence, exclusion, and humiliation, a displaced tyranny that offers object lessons in knowing your place in a theocratic order. Vigilantism here is integral to a form of governance that makes virtue of deregulation and the dispersal of sovereignty, now characteristic of global statecraft. Hindu nationalists are wont to assert that rather than have the state prevail over society, society should be encouraged to regulate itself, a kind of libertarian stance conducive to the outsourcing of disciplinary practices of dubious legitimacy, outsourcing to a range of informal actors who can be owned or denounced at will. This unfolding history has parallels in South Africa, where scholars have likewise seen lasting legacies of colonialism and racial rule as fostering an enduring doubt about the authority of law and the fitness of enforcement. Lars Burr, for instance, argued that democratic governments in the post-apartheid state remain spooked by a horror of the mob, by the threat of outlaw justice. Here again, notwithstanding a celebrated constitution, the social contract is in jeopardy. As anxiety about criminal violence mounts, wrote veteran journalist Rian Malan in 2016, more and more South Africans are looking to each other rather than the state for security. Let us pray that it doesn't lead to a descent into Thomas Hobbes's murderous state of nature. And Hobbes is the referent here in all of this. To be sure, recourse to private protection and alternative justice is not new in South Africa. White businesses and some households have long purchased the services of security firms, later to be rebranded as armed response or vigilantism with a license, as it were. In Black communities, self-protection has deep roots in African juridical practices that survived the colonial countryside and traveled to urban areas along with migrant workers at the turn of the 19th century. Under apartheid, urban Blacks, acutely distrustful of the police and the criminal justice system, had little option but to rely on informal providers of protection and dispute settlement. From Mabangalala, right-wing ganging forces, often who enjoyed state support, to Makotla, people's courts, derived from Sotho-Tswana judicial institutions. In the late years of the ancien regime, as it began to unravel, extra-legal coercion multiplied on all sides, while informal tribunals, civic organizations, and street communities expanded their hold in the townships. Afrikaner militiaries, shadowy government-sponsored operatives meted out their own forms of disciplinary violence, much of it intended to undermine the liberation struggle. The transition to democracy in South Africa was an exercise in modern state-making in late modern times. While its constitution promised rights-based inclusion, its commitment to market-based development prescribed the outsourcing of government, the privatizing of the economy, and the blocking of any real redistributions of wealth. Dismantling of formal segregation left whites feeling abandoned, while residents of poor Black neighborhoods felt no more served and protected by the new regime than they had by the old. At issue was less a sense of state weakness than its uneven presence, its quixotic combination of heavy-handedness and indifference, its availability to some and not to others. As informal and criminal enterprise burgeoned amidst deepening inequality, the neglected turned yet again to the community in search of a feeling of citizenship and community, seemingly still withheld. Street executions were becoming a regular occurrence in some parts of the country in the 1990s. Necklacing, a particular South African penal practice that had emerged to deal with political renegades in the anti-apartheid struggle, was being redeployed to strike back at crime and violent disorder. Elsewhere, in rural and semi-rural areas, there was a return to what was styled the African way of stopping crime, this being the slogan of Montle John Magolejo, the charismatic founder of Mapocho Amatamaga, the nation's largest vendor of informal policing with indigenous characteristics. To its critics, that African way amounted to brute vigilantism, but Magolejo rejects the term, and in the early 2000s, launched a version of his brand in the commercial security market, blatantly trading on a nostalgia for patriarchal authority. But his informal business also continued to thrive. Its fierce logo, two snarling tigers, being sported as defensive talisman across the Northwest countryside, where many see the threat of counter-violence as the only means of restoring order in a world they see run amok. The growing search for protection has given rise to a bewildering array of security, investigative, and quasi-judicial services offered by private companies, community organizations, NGOs, religious fraternities, tribal authorities, gangs, sometimes even taxi associations. Each has its own distinctive approach. Some collaborate with the cops, albeit more or less uneasily, informally, illegally. In certain key domains, like deadly attacks on migrants, unofficial patrols serve as incognito proxies for the state that struggles to reconcile its human rights commitments with popular xenophobia against aliens. A subtle dialectic is clearly at work here between state and civil society, one in which the legal and the extra-legal, the official and the unofficial, the secure and the unprotected interact with each other across a labile and eroding boundary. Elsewhere, John Comaroff and I have argued that this dialectic is itself part of a world historical shift from the vertical, relatively integrated structures of sovereign authority towards lateral patchworks of partial sovereignties, sovereignties of different durations and temporalities, sovereignties with jurisdiction over variably scaled terrains, populations, property, moral projects, and behavioral conventions. Sovereignties buttressed to a greater or lesser degree by corporate power and by coercion, direct and indirect. Sovereignties founded on simulacra of the law. Some scholars see the object of alternative enforcement in the post-apartheid era as having shifted from politics to crime. And superficially speaking, this may be true, as noted above in respect of necklacing, but only insofar as the two can be clearly separated, either for practical or analytical purposes. The line between politics and crime is always provisional, historical, contingent, and contested. All the more so since the capacity of modern states to hold that line, the supreme assertion of its sovereignty, has been seriously eroded. As all this suggests, the escalation of informal justice in South Africa in 1994 has been triggered by more than a heightened feeling of vulnerability, of risk in the face of rising crime, significant though they may be. It also taps into a pervasive late modern angst, a haunting fear that as the state itself morphs, as the specter of rampant crime grows in the murk of the new global economy, lawlessness might be simply impossible to bring under control, that being imminent everywhere, it invades previously protected spaces and bypasses previously policed boundaries. In the event, calls for ever more punitive responses, ever more cogent counter-violence, are a plea for a kind of action that wrests back a legible, predictable, and manageable life world. Action that might set politics and the body politic apart from crime and the criminal economy, citizen from anti-citizen, moral, public from the sovereign society of strangers. It is a plea, moreover, for a nation with a capacity to know itself, to command the means of making truth as distinguishable from deception, and social order from ethical entropy. To repeat, I'm not saying that the threat of criminal violence has been unimportant in the resort to popular justice. Reports of violent felons at large, unresolved cases, and uninvestigated sexual assaults, of sheer ineptitude, of forensic incapacity and malfeasance, of an overstretched police force continue to flood news media almost daily, particularly in South Africa, but not only there. These things perhaps are inevitable in a rapidly shifting world in which the socio-moral and material downsides of the neoliberal turn, themselves now widely documented for the world at large, and for South Africa in particular, have been so acutely felt. What I'm suggesting is that the manner in which South Africans have framed the problem and proposed to solve it has been driven not merely by instrumentalities. It has also been shaped by considerations of history and ideology, by a desire to impose some meaning, some limits on the pervasiveness of violence and malfeasance, and a desire to recognize themselves as sovereign subjects in a body politic here and now, to make real the promise of justice infinitely postponed. Barbara Uman notes of Mapocho Amatamacha, the provider of customary protection, that whatever else it establishes a moral community of sorts, even a facsimile of citizenship, and albeit ring-fenced with a fee-for-service kind of terror. Nicholas Smith goes even further. Informal enforcement is often staged by young men in defiance of a state that itself looks like a large-scale vigilante organization, attacking the rights of those it is charged with protecting. Vigilantism here is a seizure of the power of lawmaking beyond the law, an exercise in insurgent world-making. In speaking of popular violence in South Africa, Lars Burr invokes Pato Chatterjee's notion of pure politics, a self-grounding moment of direct public action, whose very promise lies in its uncertainty, its danger, its unsustainability. At stake in such moments, says Rancière, is an anarchic principle extrinsic to the political in modern times, a kind of orientation that seems to have no world of its own, a moment that enacts the will of the people, a popular sovereignty that serves as a mandate, that very sovereignty that serves as a mandate for the liberal state, but can never really be allowed to act directly politically in its own name. Here we are returned to the dual connotation of vigilantism, as at once delinquent and divine. Adventures in extrajudicial police punishment usurp the state's monopoly of violence and the law, two of the bases of Weberian sovereignty. Popular street justice in South Africa often seems to materialize out of nowhere, triggered by a subliminal sign, a coded call to arms. In communities around Cape Town in the 2010s, the prompt was often the cry of Nalisela, there's a thief. A woman recalled one such early morning summons. In no time, and I mean no time, she said, everybody was coming out, slamming doors behind them. It was as if they'd been waiting, ready all night for exactly this kind of thing to happen. Then they descended upon this man. In no time, they had finished him. This account suggests then a people in waiting, as if everybody was already primed to be summoned, to come together in this kind of leaderless choreography. The assembled crowd acts, pars pro toto, as an injured populace, condensing the sovereign collective as a total social fact. The description bears witness to an instant enrollment in a moment both in and out of time. For literally in no time, a portentous instant beyond the regular reach of the law and deliberation, the people commit an awful, certain, sacral act. As Agamben might have put it, they suspend the law, and in drawing the line, they make the law again. Moral fury distills into instant retribution, an act that refuses postponement, ambiguity, mediation, or any abstraction beyond the here and now. Killing here calls into question the prerogative that turns homicide into justice. Here Hobbes's creation myth is turned on its head. Through an act of necropolitics, the raw populace collectively makes itself sovereign, constituting itself as a body social and a body political sui generis. The instigators of people's justice of the sort tend to be described as enraged mobs, fueled by an effervescence that overwhelms reason and will. They often reject the intervention of policing, refusing to surrender their right to self-government, to concede their authority. Vigilantism of this sort casts light on the very construct of popular sovereignty itself as a kind of elementary form of political life that appears everywhere in direct proportion to the increasing privatization and abstraction of public existence. The modern state, to repeat, simultaneously gives constitutive power to the people, but denies them the capacity to actually use it, keeping the populace disciplined, as Walter Benjamin insisted, by the state's own inherent violence. In the exercise of popular sovereignty, the vigilante, singular or plural, takes hold of that law, presenting modern statehood with an image of its own possibility, grasping for an instant that divine world-making force of justice beyond the law. This form of world-making becomes ever more compelling as the orienting myths of a social contract seem ever less sustainable. As the liberal commonwealth is invalidated by ordinary experience, and as ever greater domains of collective life are privatized and fractured, as state sovereignty rests ever more flagrantly on the power to flout the law. And as governments become increasingly indistinguishable from vigilantes, indeed from organized crime, thus playing out Charles Tilley's history in reverse by losing their advantage of legitimacy, not only in India or South Africa, but the world at large. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. It was such a thought-provoking, wonderful talk, and I kept taking notes. Oh my God. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and if you have questions, write down your name on the chat box.